LangGraph implements dynamic execution control through its interrupt mechanism, enabling stateful workflows to pause at arbitrary points and await external input before resuming. This pattern facilitates human-in-the-loop interactions by serializing the current graph state via a checkpointer and exposing interrupt payloads through the interrupt field. We'll examine how this artifact constructs a review workflow using stategraph, where the review node leverages interrupt to pause execution and surface content for editing, with state persistence managed through memory saver and thread-specific resumption via command.
Import SQLite 3. From typing, import typed dict. From LangGraph, checkpoint, memory import memory saver. From LangGraph, graph import state graph start end. From LangGraph, types import command interrupt. Class review state type dict. Generated text, SDR. Def review node state, review state. Hash ask a reviewer to edit the generated content. Updated equals interrupt. Instruction, review and edit this content. Content, state generated text. Return generated text, updated. Builder equals state graph review state. Builder, add node review, review node. Builder add edge start, review. Builder, add edge review, end. Checkpointer equals memory saver. Graph equals builder. Compile checkpointer equals checkpointer. Config, configurable. Threaded, review 42. Initial equals graph, invoke generated text. Initial draft, config equals config. Print initial, interrupt, hash interruptful u equals instruction. Content, hash resume with the edited text from the reviewer. Final state equals graph invoke. Command resume equals improved draft after review. Config equals config. Print final state, generated text, hash, improved draft after review.
This code demonstrates a human-in-the-loop review workflow using LangGraph's interrupt mechanism. The pattern creates a simple linear graph with a single review node that pauses execution to request human input, then resumes with the edited content. The interrupt function is called within the review node, which saves the graph state via the memory saver checkpointer and returns a payload containing review instructions and the current content. This payload surfaces in the interrupt field, allowing the caller to see what the graph is waiting for. The workflow uses a persistent, threaded, review 42 to maintain state across invocations. When the graph is resumed with command resume equals, the provided value becomes the return value of the interrupt call, updating the state with the reviewed content. This approach is particularly useful for content generation pipelines where human oversight is required, as it cleanly separates automated generation from manual review while maintaining the execution context. The implementation shows how interrupts enable dynamic pausing at any point in node execution, unlike static breakpoints. The checkpointer ensures state persistence, making this pattern suitable for long-running workflows. However, the in-memory checkpointer used here would need to be replaced with a durable solution like SQLite Saver for production use. The pattern also demonstrates how interrupt payloads can carry structured data to guide the human reviewer, with the resume mechanism providing a clean way to inject the reviewed content back into the workflow. Let's break it down.
Import SQLite 3.
Imports SQLite 3, Python's built-in library for interacting with SQLite databases, enabling database operations like creating, reading, updating, and deleting records in a lightweight, file-based SQL database system.
From typing, import typed dict.
Imports typed dict from the typing module, which enables creating dictionary types with specific key-value type annotations for type checking and code clarity.
From LangGraph, checkpoint, memory import memory saver.
Imports the memory saver class from LangGraph. Checkpoint, Memory, which provides in-memory checkpointing functionality for saving and restoring graph execution states.
From LangGraph, graph import state graph start end.
Import state graph, start, and end from the LangGraph graph module. State graph is a class for defining stateful workflows, while start and end are constants representing the entry and exit points of the graph.
From LangGraph, types import command interrupt.
Imports the command, class, and interrupt function from LangGraph's types module, providing tools for pausing graph execution and resuming with external input.
Class review state type dict.
Defines a review state class that inherits from typed dict, establishing a type-hinted dictionary structure for storing review-related data with explicit key-value type expectations. This creates a strongly typed container where each field's type is enforced at development time, though the actual runtime behavior remains a standard dictionary. The empty body indicates field definitions would follow in subsequent lines, but this line specifically just declares the type dictionary base.
Def review node state, review state.
Defines a function named reviewNode that accepts a single parameter, state, with type annotation, review state. This establishes a function signature for processing review-related state data, though the implementation details aren't visible in this segment. The function is likely part of a graph node in LangGraph that handles review operations, but this line only shows the declaration.
Updated equals interrupt.
Calls the interrupt function with an empty dictionary as its argument, which pauses graph execution at this point and saves the current state. The empty dictionary will be returned to the caller in the interrupt field, signaling that the graph is waiting for external input to resume.
Instruction: review and edit this content.
Assigns the string review and edit this content to a variable named instruction. This creates a simple text instruction that could be used later in the code, though the specific usage isn't visible in this segment. The value is a clear directive for content review and editing tasks.
Content, state-generated text.
Assigns the value of state-generated text to a key named content in what appears to be a dictionary or JSON-like structure. This line is likely preparing data for output or transmission, where the generated text from the graph state is being labeled as the main content.
Return generated text, updated.
Returns a dictionary with a single key generated text mapped to the value of the variable updated. This is a standard Python dictionary return, where the output is structured as generated text, updated, making the generated content accessible under the generated text key.
Builder equals state graph review state.
Creates a state graph instance using review state as the state schema. This initializes a graph builder that will manage state transitions and node execution based on the defined review state structure.
Builder, add node review, review node.
Adds a node named review to the graph builder, where review node is the function or component that will execute when this node is reached during graph traversal. This establishes review as a named step in the workflow that can be connected to other nodes.
Builder at edge start, review.
Adds a directed edge from the start node to the review node in the graph being constructed. This establishes that execution should flow from the graph's entry point to the node named review when the graph runs. The builder object's addEdge method creates this connection between the two specified nodes.
Builder, add edge review, end.
Adds a directed edge from the review node to the end node in the graph, establishing that after the review node completes execution, the graph workflow should terminate. This creates a clear termination path where the graph stops processing once it reaches the review stage.
Checkpointer equals memory saver.
Creates a checkpointer instance using the memory saver class, which handles saving and restoring graph execution state in memory. This object will be used to persist the graph's state when interrupts occur, allowing execution to resume later from the same point.
Graph equals builder. Compile checkpointer equals checkpointer.
Compiles the graph builder into an executable graph instance with checkpointing enabled. The checkpointer parameter specifies the persistence mechanism that will handle saving and restoring the graph's execution state, allowing for resumable workflows and interrupt handling. This creates a graph that can pause execution at interrupt points and later resume from the exact saved state using the configured checkpointer.
Config, configurable, threaded, review 42.
Creates a configuration dictionary with a nested, configurable key that sets threaded to review 42. This establishes a persistent identifier for checkpointing and resuming graph execution at a specific state.
Initial equals graph, invoke generated text. Initial draft, config equals config.
Invokes the LangGraph graph with an initial input containing a generated text value of initial draft and applies the specified configuration. The invoke method triggers graph execution with the provided data and settings, potentially starting a new execution thread or resuming an existing one based on the configurations threaded.
Print initial interrupt, hash interrupt value equals instruction. Content.
Prints the value stored in the interrupt key of the initial dictionary, which contains an interrupt object with an instruction and content payload. The output shows the interrupt structure that was triggered during graph execution, indicating the graph is paused and waiting for external input to resume.
Final state equals graph invoke.
Invokes the LangGraph execution with the current graph configuration and returns the final state after processing. The invoke method triggers the graph's execution flow, which may include interrupt points where external input is required. If an interrupt occurs during execution, the graph state is persisted, and the interrupt field will contain the payload passed to the interrupt call, allowing the caller to provide the necessary input before resuming. The result is stored in final state, representing the completed or paused state of the graph execution.
Command resume equals improved draft after review.
Creates a command object with a resume parameter set to improved draft after review, which provides the value that will be passed back to the interrupted graph execution when it resumes. This specific command carries the external input needed to continue processing after an interrupt was triggered.
Config equals config.
Passes the config parameter to a function or constructor, likely configuring interrupt behavior in LangGraph by specifying thread persistence and checkpointing settings. The visible parameter suggests this controls how execution state is managed when interrupts pause the graph.
Print final state, generated text, hash, improved draft after review.
Prints the value associated with the key generated text from the final state dictionary, which outputs the string improved draft after review. This implementation demonstrates LangGraph's interrupt mechanism for human-in-the-loop workflows. The core pattern uses interrupt within the review node to pause execution and surface content for editing, with the graph state persisted via memory saver. The threaded in the config maintains state across invocations, while the interrupt field exposes the payload to the caller. When resumed with command, the provided value becomes the return of interrupt, updating the state. This approach cleanly separates automated generation from manual review while maintaining execution context, though the in-memory checkpointer would need replacement for production use. The pattern shows how interrupts enable dynamic pausing at any execution point, unlike static breakpoints, with structured data guiding human reviewers and a clean resume mechanism for injecting reviewed content back into the workflow.
The interrupt whispers to the checkpoint, but the threaded forgets its own name.